Okay, welcome to today, third day, Saturday, BAPT 2021 conference. Great to see everyone back. Really proud to have one of our keynotes next from Roger Pearman, who's joining us from the US. And he's going to talk about type development. Thank you, Roger.
Well, thank you. And to all of you who've decided to engage in this session with me, I have to tell you how grateful I am that you're interested and how grateful I am that BAPT was interested in some of my observations that hopefully will be useful for you and the people with whom you work. When I thought about the label of this talk, I came to several sort of preliminary titles that I was going to put forth on type development. And as I thought about it, I realized that, you know, if we're really serious about type development, that has some significant kinds of questions and significant explorations that we should put on the table to review and consider. So as I thought about my work over the last 45 years of coaching and facilitating and helping folks use typology in their own self-awareness and growth and development, it struck me that consistently as I thought about it, there were 10 areas of action that was central to the growth and development of those people that I had worked with. So please take this presentation as a list of things to put on the explore list. This presentation is intended to say, here are 10 things that consistently have paid rich dividends for individuals who were eager to make more sense of their personality and of psychological type in their lives, and the kinds of things that what I would call the serious learner has undertaken. So you might elevate this as simply a potential checklist of things that you want to put on the radar. I have been at this, as I just mentioned, a very long time. Psychological type came into my life as a freshman in the university setting, and it created such enormous curiosity for me that I proceeded to spend a lot of time in the library reading Jung and reading other things I could find that Jung referred to. And then, of course, when I did my graduate work, I proceeded to utilize type. Mary McCauley had given me my introduction to the MBTI in 1979, 1980, and that struck up a friendship and a relationship that I very much enjoyed over the many years. I have friends today that I've known all of these many years who say to me, "Are you still talking about type?" And I say, yes, because it's endlessly interesting in terms of the possibilities and connections and the discoveries. And I would say at the end of the day, all of my work that I've tried to do, and even in this little short period of time we're going to have together today, is really captured by Emily Dickinson's line that she hoped with her work to ignite the imagination and light the slow fuse of the possible. And I actually believe that one of the things type has done for me is just that very thing. It really ignited my imagination, and I've seen it ignite the imagination of lots and lots of people, and in so doing, initiate possible discoveries that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And so I see this as kind of my mission as I go about doing the work that I do. I like to think in these ways: what's likely and probable, not necessarily absolute and definitive, And I would say to you that as we go through this material, please keep in mind, though I'm fairly convinced that these particular strategies make a difference, I realize that it comes from a space where I see things, as I said, as likely and probable, not absolute and definitive. I find that the more information we have and the more we discover, the more questions there are. And I simply find that it's a more comfortable space to ponder and hypothesize and explore and test out. I do like the statement that Isabel Myers made at the end of Gifts Differing when she said that, you know, the goal of type development is in helping us make our perceptions clearer and our judgments more sound. And I would consider that to be the goal of mature adult development. What are the things that we can do to elevate our sense of perception and our depths of perception and enrich the ways in which we make judgments so that, in fact, we are maximizing the resources and the gifts that we've been given. So as we go through this, yes, I take the view that Jung helped us understand in a very interesting way that there are 4 ways of thinking about perceiving information and perceiving experiences, and 4 ways of processing and making choices, and that these work together to create a gestalt. And I believe that all the tactics that I'm going to touch on are in fact things that each and every one of the 16 types, or if you have a different typological system, I have found that these patterns, these particular tactics hold up. Years ago, I did a massive research piece with the database at the Center for Creative Leadership. The Center for Creative Leadership is the standalone, not-for-profit institute that's headquartered in Greensboro, North Carolina, but has operations all over the world. And for some 40 years, they collected type data and personality data from other tools and 360 data, and they let me analyze that data to look for patterns and themes. And much of that research has influenced the things that I've shared and published over the years. One of the things in that research that I found to be quite compelling was if you took the scale, it's technically called ego integration of the CPI, the California Psychological Inventory. It's considered one of the most robust scales in psychology. And you looked at how, again, using the frame of the 16 types, how the 16 types scored at the top end of that scale, in the middle of that scale, and the bottom of that scale. You discovered that, in fact, at the top end of that scale, all 16 types are viewed and are expressive of the use of a range of psychological energies and behaviors that do not exist for those at the low end of that scale. And the more I explored that data, it became very clear to me that when you look at the gestalt of a type like ISTJ or ESTJ or INFP, you begin to see that there are some, what I might call factors that cut across the types that all of us can utilize to enrich our own growth and development. What I'm going to suggest to you are 10 particular strategies for which there's no easy path. In other words, there's no, as you'll see in a minute, there's no shortcut. I've pulled on the various tactics and the sort of background that comes from neuroscience and behavioral learning strategies, as well as psychodynamic and psychoanalytic traditions, and of course, my ongoing interest in the role of emotions and individual well-being. As a coach or a facilitator, I often get questions from people that go like this. I really would like to develop more consistency of perspective, or I really want to be more imaginative or creative, or I'd really like to learn how to manage conflict more productively. And when you start working with individuals, you know that their desire to achieve this comes from a deep place, and more often than not, the work that's required surprises them as to what's going to be necessary to get from where they are to where they want to be. In other words, we all like our comfort zone, but the magic happens outside the comfort zone. And there's a neurological reason why this image holds true. One is we are wired to pursue comfort, avoid pain, and find an efficient path to do both. So whenever we're in situations, a deeply embedded program inside of all of us is what's comfortable, and our brain helps us move in that direction to what's comfortable. Let's avoid pain or discomfort, and let's not waste any energy, because after all, we need that energy, or may need that energy for other things. Our very, very smart brain is busily calculating and estimating what are the things we may need to do in order to have the energy we need to survive and thrive. So we have a host of resistors already in the programming. Whenever we start thinking about development and you ponder why it is that people who say, I want to do X, but they never get there. I want to lose 20 pounds, but they never get there. I want to be more interpersonally warm, but they never get there. Well, there are reasons why that happens. There are no pills, no creams, no special foods, no surgical procedures in any of what I'm going to suggest in the 10 strategies or tactics. There's work and play to be done. And what I find is when people start learning, there's work to be done, and they kind of pique their interest when I talk about play. It's easier. Isn't there a quick solution, right? Many of you may be organizational consultants like myself, and it is quite common for me to get a call from a manager who says, gosh, I have a team that's not working very well, not being very effective. And I understand you work with teams and you help people understand and, if you will, become more effective with working on a team. And then after they do their statement, I ask them a question. I say, well, what is it costing you or the organization? And usually there's silence on the phone. And I say, he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, if it's not working well, if the team's not working well, does it matter? Well, yes, it matters, because we haven't launched the product or we haven't launched the service. We're 6 months behind. Based on our revenue projections, the fact that we're 6 months behind has cost us roughly $2 million. So they go through and they now tell me the cost of this dysfunctional team. And I say then to them, so you're asking me in 1 hour to solve a $2 million problem. I'll say, well, that pill hasn't been invented yet. So here's what's going to be required, the work that's going to be required to help your team get to where you want it to be. And there's a, if you will, science of teams that we can apply. And whether we get to use psychological type or not, directly and consciously with the group, I always use type in my engineering, if you will, and working with the group. I happen to think that type development particularly is both complicated and complex. When we think about complicated, we really are talking about more horizontal development. What are the kinds of skills and the kinds of behaviors that we can add to our repertoire to help us be more adaptive in a circumstance. And if we're genuinely going to, if you will, integrate a new perspective and new approach to our work and our life, it requires a more complex framework in understanding the changes that are required. In complexity, we're really thinking about the intersection of dynamics. We're thinking about patterns and the way things emerge. We have to be willing to hypothesize and check out before we conclude. It's an open system, not a closed system. Now, I believe there's a place for, if you will, both in terms of how we might approach our development and our growth. But I happen to believe that too many folk have approached type development from a complicated frame. In other words, if we develop the following skills, we will enhance our extroverted sensing. Well, maybe that could be true in some ways, not necessarily true. And in fact, if we understand extroverted sensing, for example, in a dynamic way, it takes on more character. So I approach this whole topic, if you will, in sharing with you my assumptions that in fact we are looking at something that's a somewhat complicated and complex matter when we think about development. Now, I know for most of you, you see my layout and you immediately want to say, well, no, that's not the framework that we're all relying on today. And I want that dissonance to just go off to the side for a minute. And the two main points I want to make about our typological models and systems that we are exploring. One is that when we talk about developing, we really are talking about looking at the whole psychic system to move it toward greater health and adaptability. And what I think of when I think of type is about energy flow and how typology helps us get a handle on both dispositions and compensations that our psychology makes as we move through things in life. I have an analogy that I offer for those folks who like to talk serious about type, and that is, as best I can tell, both from a developmental perspective and having been an observer for these many decades, typology is kind of like our own fractal formula. It shows itself in small ways and big ways and is threaded through our life. And the more we explore how those typological patterns show up and the energies we've used and ignored, in fact, can be quite informative for us. So as we move into the 10 tactics that I want to bring to your attention, I do so with this spirit in mind. In the Collective Works 13, Jung makes the very clear statement that, you know, the development of our personality is one of the most costly of all things. It's a matter of saying yay to yourself, to taking oneself as the most serious of tasks. And this, to me, is an extremely demanding statement of being conscious of everything one does and keeping it before your eyes in all of its dubious aspects. It's a task that taxes us to the utmost. So I'm going to suggest that as I go through these 10 tactics, that you might, in fact, if you hear something and you go, I'd never do that, that's probably a sign that that's what you need to put on your list. So number one, I encourage people as they think about their development and growth to begin with the end in mind. And by that, I mean, just to use the poet's line, tell me what is your plan to do with your one wild, precious life? Or as Wicks has suggested, what is seeking to live through you? Or as Carol Pearson has invited us to consider, what story is trying to live through you? Of course, I've played a bit here with a modified Shakespeare line, to be or not to be open to the unique self unfolding in you, is what I mean by taking the time to do some soul work, to think about who we are and what that story is that is waiting to unfold and show itself, and to become attentive to the fact that you are not your type. You are not the narrators in your head. You're much bigger than that. And one of our challenges in being able to answer this question begin with the end in mind is to get some clarity about the things to which we're addicted. I know addiction is often always referred to related to drugs, but actually, when you think about what an addiction is a rewarding and reinforcing of cravings that we seek in higher dosages to have a somewhat chronic reliance on that to help us deal with what is in front of us. And I invite folks to think about the kinds of addictions that are in the way of being clear about what you might do and how you might allow that story to come through. And sometimes it needs to be a Phoenix moment where, in fact, there is a complete renewal and a complete revision that occurs. And that process, as we all know, is in fact quite challenging and needs to be facilitated. Wicks made the statement that the art of living is essentially a development and transformation of the power of inward choice. And that's a message that will penetrate the comments that I'm going to make in the next 9 tactics. Its products are fashioned in the workshop of the soul. And I love that line and believe, in fact, it speaks directly to proposition number 1, begin with the end in mind. Number 2 is to invite folks to think about and make choices. And I use the chessboard here to say, make strategic choices about learning experiences that we might choose to have. One of the things that I find is that the diversity and intensity and variety of experiences and degrees of adversity in experiences really becomes a great stage in which to learn things and to choose diverse experiences and to engage in a variety of places to explore ideas and possibilities is a conscious choice and one that enables us to build some new capabilities. In my particular field, the talent management field, we've known since the 80s that whenever you look at development, you will find when you ask people or study how they got to be as they are as a leader or a manager, we know that 70% of what's happened that mold their experience, in fact, is their experiences that they've had. 20% of it has to do with people that they've worked with, a boss, and 10% related to courses or books or things of that nature. We know that hardships teach a lot of lessons, but we would none of us intentionally choose a hardship. Question is how we explore that hardship to make the most of it in our lives. The great theologian Paul Tillich stated, our vitality is as great as our intentionality. And I believe that when we approach learning experiences with intention, we maximize the opportunity to grow. In a series of research pieces published last year, a group of researchers were looking at folks of basically the same age with the same health problems, engaged in the same rehab. And what they noticed was everybody had improvements, but there was a subgroup whose medical and overall health improvements were 5 times greater than everybody else. So they wanted to find out what's the difference. And so they started interviewing and collecting survey data on these rehab patients. And lo and behold, what they found was those who had some improvement, when asked the question, why do you do this rehab? And they said, well, my doctor told me I had to. to those who were getting 5% better performance, 5 times, not 5%, 5 times better performance by all health indices. When asked, why do you do this? They said things like, well, I want to be have a lot of energy and have the ability to play with my grandchildren. I want to make sure that I get to use some of my special things I've learned in my life to help the kids in our neighborhood. They had a larger purpose of intention, and that larger purpose enabled their vitality to show up. So we can select experiences that stretch and exercise parts of ourselves we've forgotten. And in my most recent edition of I'm Not Crazy, I added a section on learnings through different experiences that exercise some of our typological muscles that we've probably ignored. Tactic 3, churning. We might know, some of us who were raised in the country or in family farms, that churning was what you did if you wanted to produce buttermilk and butter, and that there was a lot of work involved with that process. And of course, I found it quite interesting as I explored the Jung Institute of San Francisco, that their model, their logo has snails. And when you read about the artist who did this, the artist pointed out that the snails move slowly around the center, symbolizing the slow pace of deep understanding. I invite people that when they're confused, puzzled, feeling ambiguous, feeling as though they don't have answers, to sleep on it. I invite them to churn with intention, to give it over to their unconscious selves, and to do so with instruction. I happen to have names for my different psychological processes, and sometimes I will call them out and say, you know, I'm turning this over to you, and tomorrow morning, I hope you'll have an answer for me. And lo and behold, more often than not, they do. I've had this strategy and used this strategy with a number of people who've come back and said, it's amazing. And I've said, yes, your brain is wonderful. Your psyche is spectacular, and given an opportunity, if you will allow yourself to give it power, you can find that there are answers and growth that can occur by allowing things to stew and churn as you consider the possibilities and allow your unconscious to do the very thing that it can do. Related to it is the use of active imagination, tactic number 4. This particular strategy, there's been a great deal written about it. We know that Jung found this to be particularly effective. I've found that when I can get an individual to think through, as a handout I take them through to think about how to utilize active imagination, you see it described here, and that this will be in a PDF for you to have access to. But I just want to tell this story about this statue. I was in a gallery in Mexico, and as I was walking through the gallery, it was as if I was hearing my name being called, and I became spectacularly mesmerized by this statue. And as I studied the statue and I began to have a conversation, and I was aware I was in the dynamic of active imagination. And as I engaged in the dialogue with this statue, it became clear to me the statue had a name, and he gave me his name. And he also informed me that I needed to be in ongoing conversations with my energy here, this daemon that came into my life. And lo and behold, I had to bring him home. And so he and I have active conversations. And I found that it's amazing when we allow ourselves to go beyond simply observing the image and engage in the process of utilizing our imaginative voices, the things we can learn about ourselves and the power of symbols, what they can give us in our understanding and growth and development with others. One of the things that I found particularly important is to have people sort of do an excavation of the lessons of experience. When I ask people, tell me about the top 5 things you've learned, and what did you learn, and how does that learning show itself in your daily life? They find it's very easy to do. They will often say, well, you know, when I was 7 years old and my grandfather did X, or I had a particular assignment I learned, or I had feedback in my first job, and this is what I learned and how I've integrated this into my life. And I invite folks to start thinking about what I call an experience map. How does that experience penetrate your awareness and your understanding of yourself? Do you and are you able to narrate and dialogue with that experience? I will invite them, if there was a particular person or particular object in the experience, to write a dialogue from the perspective of that object. What would that object say to you in this experience that you've had? What would be its message to you about what it is that you've done with this particular object or inside this particular engagement or interaction with another person? I find that getting people to excavate their lessons of experience can often be quite powerful. The simple question, what are the 10 most important experiences that you've had that have in fact inspired and motivated you, can unfold some incredible lessons that as they tell that story, you will hear their typology show up in every single example in ways in which they learn some things about themselves that they would not have learned without having this excavation of lessons of experience. Now, I like to remind people that you are never a prisoner of your past. It is just a lesson. And in fact, there's this notion, if you will, that, gosh, if we learn from our past and we learn and integrate the lesson effectively, we have it as a capability to rely on when we need it again in the future. Tactic 6, play with a question in mind. And I've pulled the Fool card from the tarot deck here because it's precisely the spirit with which I encourage people to play joyfully with a question in mind. Some of you will remember that in 1997, when I gave a keynote address at the APT International Conference in the United States, I had, the year before I gave the talk, I had invited representatives of each of the 16 types as sorted by the MBTI to create a mandala and to simply draw it as they thought about how they experience their psyche. How does the psyche work? And you see on the screen 5 of those particular images that people shared and the stories that they shared. And I shared that in the keynote, and that's been 23, 24 years. And I still get letters from these people about how powerful that experience was, and how they continue to play in drawing as they consider various issues in their life and various things they strive to achieve, and how they let those energies show up. And I encourage people to find time, to always make time to play, whether it's drawing, whether it's painting, whether it's taking pictures, engaging in some sort of dramatic events or activities, something that allows you to play, and especially with the question in mind. Now, today with digital tools that we have, for example, I have on my iPad a little application called Procreate, and it's an application that allows me to draw. And I now have about 2,000 mandalas where I go in and I am thinking about something, and I allow myself just to play with the images and the colors and to think about this situation or circumstance that I'm in. And I'm always delighted with how aware this play brings things to my mind. And when I've asked other people to do so, to be a fool, to discover something fresh with a beginner's mind, they almost always come back with, gosh, I need to, and I will be making more time to play with questions in mind, not to play to find an answer, but to play with intention and exploration, to be a fool in a new space. It is, as Jung reminded us, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our life, and we'll call it fate. So we want to make sure that we, in fact, provide opportunities to play so that we allow those unconscious energies to have their opportunity to inform us. Now, this word grasp comes from the aggregation of just massive amounts of research on learning, which tells us that when we're learning a behavior and learning a skill or learning to utilize other kinds of energies, if you will, that number one, it takes time. It's gradual. You can't do it all at once. If you want to test this, go look at the video Backwards Bicycle, as the gentleman tries to show you what it takes to relearn to ride a bicycle on a simple change that has occurred. It's a beautiful illustration of how it is that learning takes time. There has to be reinforcement. We have to create for ourselves ways to reinforce the thing we're trying most to practice and do. We have to find spaces to do repetition. We have to find places where we can repeat the behavior in different contexts, actively use the behavior in new and different ways. Now, I have around stimulus control some asterisks because I'm going to say more about that they're things we have to be very intentional about if we're going to learn with this intentional effort. And then, of course, always practice and get feedback when we're trying to, in fact, integrate a new behavior into our lives. Now, there are two types of stimulus control. There is the external stimulus, the external environment. One of the reasons why a lot of people fail at what they're trying to change is they're not mindful of where they're trying to learn it or trying to make the shift, and not mindful of the cues in their environment that ultimately reinforce what they're doing. And then, of course, there's the internal messaging, the internal environment that we need also to learn to control. The strategy that some folks have found to be useful to deal with the noise that goes on when we're trying to, remember I said at the beginning, our brain has 100,000 different programs to resist discomfort. Then one of those programs has to do with internal noises that get made when we're trying to do something. And it's an effort to try to say, you don't really need to do this because we have another way that's been efficient in the past. So there are four kinds of noise, or four voices that I found that consistently show up and typologically actually show up in different ways. The automatic negative thoughts, the worldwide worthless worries, the unidentified fearless objects, and the task unrelated thoughts are ongoing narrations, especially when we're trying to focus on something. Over the last couple of years, I've been asking people as they learn about these definitions to simply rank order what is the biggest voice in your head when you're finding a resistance to something. What's the biggest voice that shows up? And for STs, the voice that shows up the most is task unrelated thoughts. For SFs, the voice that shows up the most is unidentified fearless objects. For NFs, worldwide worthless worries. For NTs, automatic negative thoughts. Now, that's just one small set of data, one small set of trends. Yet, it's interesting to me, we all acknowledge those voices are there, and there appears to be a typological attraction to and investment in a certain kind of noise that can get in the way. Now, the most powerful automatic negative thought is the imposter syndrome. And as our psychologist friend here is saying to the gentleman, well, you know, your fear of being publicly exposed as a fraud is a stress-related disorder called imposter syndrome. It's common among high-profile authority positions and, of course, in actual phonies like you. So we have that voice that runs around in there that brings doubt to us. Sometimes we think we're making a choice that's going to have an endless negative outcome and have negative impacts throughout our choices in our life. And in fact, there's no basis for the worldwide worthless worry. We become fearful of conversations or interactions, and we're afraid that someone's going to say something to us. And so we don't engage, and we have a voice in our head that says, you don't want to go there because it'll be too daggone uncomfortable. Or we worry about if we don't do certain things, or if we act too quickly, there's going to be massive negative outcomes from those choices. Well, there are ways we can, in fact, get those voices in check. One, sometimes we're over invested in thinking about the future, and that activates these voices. Or we think about all the evidence of the past that activates these voices. Or we wind ourselves sort of splitting our head on what we've done in the past and what we need to do in the future, when in fact, what we most need to do is mindfully ask ourselves, what am I trying to achieve now in the present? How can I quiet those voices so that, in fact, I'm able to be fully present and maximize my focus and attention on learning and integrating the new learning into my life? As the Dalai Lama has said, if it can be solved, there's no need to worry. If it can't be solved, worry is of no use. So I invite us to be cognizant of being fully in the present. So as we think about what we can actually address and take care of. Tactic number 8 has to do with competing commitments. And competing commitments really are about those things in our identity that we've so deeply threaded through who we are that we simply, they run counter to things we say we want to do. And this incredible work by Bob Kagan out of Harvard and some of his other students have shown us that these deep competing commitments, in fact, unattended, will create all kinds of energy to prevent us from exploring the very thing we say we want to do. Kagan and Leahy have a piece entitled Immunity to Change, which if you've never read, I encourage you to do. And I give this book to my clients to invite them to think about what are the things you are so deeply committed to that's a part of your identity. And in that work, there's a grid that Kagan invites people to think about. And I've used this many times to help people unfreeze some of the things that are getting in their way as they grow and change. I use it myself when I particularly know there's something I want to attend to, and I keep finding there's resistance, or I say I want to do X, but I don't. And I start reflecting on that, and I start asking myself this question: what is it I'm doing in opposition to the change I said I want to do? Well, there's a reason why I keep doing the things that's in opposition to what I say I want to do, because as I dig deeper, there's an assumption. And that assumption is an identity-based assumption that I probably should test out. And if I test out and begin to see a new and different way, in fact, I might decide to let go of some of those competing commitments that can get in the way. Because as has been pointed out by many thinkers, change in and of itself is not painful. It's the resistance to change that is painful. And it's painful because we have to do the work to explore what are those deep sources of resistance that in fact are getting in the way. Idea number 9, I call an idea adventure. And I've been doing this with folks to challenge them to think about, if a miracle occurred and you had achieved X or Y or Z, whatever it happens to be, what would that be like? What would that look like? And I want you to go find some images that illustrate the very thing you believe you're seeking to reach. And it's quite fascinating. When I ask them to do that, I say, cut up magazines, go find pictures on the web of great pieces of art that contrast with your thinking about this situation that you're dealing with. One of the wonderful things this digital age has enabled us to do is to do things like this, where we can be together from all over the world and share and talk and enjoy this kind of information sharing. That also has given us a chance to go on our own journeys. I know that very often I find when I am realizing that, gosh, I seem to be stuck on something, I'll go do a virtual tour of a museum somewhere in the world to help stir it up, to make sure that I'm looking for contrasting images and information. What are those things that are opposite from myself? What's the great lesson of curiosity for me as I try to explore what's prompting and urging me to move in a new and different direction? So idea adventures can have, as we know, images can have enormous power. Tactic number 10 has to do with being a pursuer of feedback. I happen to believe that anything you do generates information, and if you are attentive to the world around you is giving you feedback. The world around you is providing information that you can utilize to feed forward. Feedback is really the information of how our being impacts the world around us. Error, when we make errors, is a form of feedback. I sometimes, when I realized I had thought I had crafted a message or an email, and lo and behold, no sooner had I hit send did I realize I left out a key word. And I realized, well, what prompted that error? What is it that went into that particular error? And as I explore that, I realized some things about where my mind is, where my head is as I'm working on that particular message. So being relentlessly curious about how we impact the world, I believe, makes a difference. Now, in a little funny cartoon, the guy says to the other, I found 90% of success isn't showing up, it's shutting up. You can bet someone gave this person feedback that said you need to be more of a listener and less of a arguer if you want to be successful. So I think feedback is best summarized by the Jihari window model that says, whether you like it or not, every interaction you have with someone, there are 4 things at work. There is what you and that person have together, which is the arena. There are things that person is observing and coming to their own hypotheses about you that they don't share. And insofar as they don't share it, you don't know it, and it's a blind spot. Likewise, there are things you don't share. And insofar as you don't share it, you don't disclose it, it's a hidden piece of information. And the more we expand the arena, the less, if you will, darkness there is in understanding how my behavior impacts others and what I might do to enhance that impact if I so choose. If it's important to me to show the kind of care and concern and embrace and to celebrate and elevate other folks, then I need to be cognizant. And type has certainly taught us all this, that what some people need is quite different from what other people need. And by being attuned to feedback, I know how I need to flex and change in order for growth to occur. So I would say that, you know, we have to be willing to be open to change if in fact we are going to make change, make growth, make development possible in our lives and in our, certainly in our work with others. This little image came up recently and I really had quite a chuckle, and it's quite true. When you think about it, if you did just one little shift a day, if you said to yourself, I'm going to explore one of my competing commitments every day, just one of those competing commitments, or I'm just going to play an hour or 15 minutes a day, whatever that happens to be, of choosing one of the tactics, one little bit of shift and adjustment over the year will produce a significant number, a significant shift and change. We know that this is true. We've seen it, and it happens in a multiplicity of ways. We need to be reminded that when we talk about growth and change, it's not necessarily meaning a wholesale shift of who we are as much as an increase in our perspective and in our range of capabilities, which often means exercising certain psychological energies that we've left dormant and not paid attention to. So I would say that across the 10 tactics, there are reminders. Many of these you know. There are reprompters, and as I said earlier, you hear something, you go, I could never do that. That's the message from your brain trying to keep you from not stepping into something that's going to be a miracle moment for you. So make sure that as you're doing the play and the new behavior testing, that you do it with intention, and that it is the intentionality and it is the directive to your unconscious, meaning I invite you to show up. I invite the unconscious to show up to help me in the way that it can. We will learn and grow. So I hope that these have been helpful prompters and thoughts for you. And for those of you who want to participate in my ongoing type study, which I've been doing now for about 1.5 years, 2 years, where, and free for anybody who wants to do it. If you have 3 people who are willing to rate your behavior, then you can get a type report. And my goal here is eventually to publish a document that says individuals who are clear about their type and who have people who know them well, have observed these various patterns, have this kind of congruence, which allows us to know that the type patterns have, if you will, realness. So we're up to now, if I think about it, I think it's around 2,600 folk who participated in the type study, and I hope there will be some more folks who will be willing to do that, so that when I get to that work, it will contribute to the conversation of the use of the 8 functions within type. So I thank you for your attention, and I thank you for the opportunity to be with you. And I know there are things that you also need to get to today. We have a minute or two for question or reaction. I'm happy to provide a response if it would be useful.
So yeah, Roger, thank you very much. Just, yeah, we can go over a bit. The next talks are at 1/2 the hour that we're just approaching, whatever that hour is in your time zone. I'm just going to pause the recording now. We'll stop it.